George Washington is often honored as the father of the nation for his pivotal role in the founding of the United States. He not only led the Continental Army to victory in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, but he also served as the first president of the United States from 1789 to 1797. Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention and left a lasting legacy with his name etched into the nation's capitals, parks, and countless cities. Today, his image appears on both the US $1 bill and the quarter. Born on February 22, 1732, February 11th, Old Style, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, Washington was deeply influenced by his family background. His father, Augustine Washington, was a well-traveled and enterprising landowner who had been educated in England and engaged in various businesses, including milling and iron mining. Augustine's second wife, Mary Ball, was George's mother. The Washington family had a distinguished past in England, with early ancestors receiving land from Henry VIII and holding public office, although their fortunes waned during the Puritan Revolution. George's grandfather, John Washington, established the family's American legacy by emigrating to Virginia in 1657. The family home in Sulgrave, Northamptonshire, now stands as a Washington memorial. George's early years were spent on Ferry Farm, near the Rappahannock River. Details of his youth are scant, and many of the popular stories, such as the story of the cherry tree, are considered fiction. He attended school intermittently between the ages of 7 and 15, taught by a church sexton and later by a private tutor named Williams. His education focused on practical mathematics, such as surveying and measuring land, along with geography, Latin, and some familiarity with literature, such as The Spectator. At the age of 14, he copied a list of moral principles, the principles of citizenship and decent behavior, which he carefully preserved, reflecting his early sense of discipline and character. However, most of his real education came through experience in the fields of tobacco farming, cattle raising, and land surveying. After his father's death in 1743, young George, then only 11 years old, was taken into the care of his half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Lawrence, a respectable and well-mannered man, had inherited the Little Hunting Creek estate, later renamed Mount Vernon in honor of Admiral Edward Vernon, under whom Lawrence served. Lawrence's wife, Anne Fairfax, came from a prominent family, and through him, George was introduced to a refined and socially distinguished world. With connections such as George William Fairfax of nearby Belvoir and the Carlisle family of Alexandria, George Washington was shaped by the values, manners, and opportunities of Virginia's elite society. Young men were the first to turn to surveying as a profession. Lord Fairfax, a middle-aged bachelor who owned over 5 million acres, 2 million hectares in northern Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley, came to America in 1746 to live with his cousin George William at Belvoir and to look after his estates. 2 years later, he sent a party to survey and plan his lands in the Shenandoah Valley so that settlers from Pennsylvania could be made regular tenants. With Prince William County in charge, Washington accompanied him as assistant. The 16-year-old boy kept a fragmentary diary of the trip, which shows a skill in observation. He describes the discomfort of sleeping under a threadbare blanket of bears with twice the weight of vermin, such as lice, fleas, etc. An encounter with an Indian war party with a skull, Pennsylvania German emigrants, a collection of ignorant people like the Indians. They will never speak English, but when spoken to, they all speak Dutch. And the serving of roast wild turkey on a large chip, as we had none for dishes. The following year, 1749, with the assistance of Lord Fairfax, Washington received an appointment as government surveyor of Culpeper County, and for more than 2 years he was almost continuously busy, surveying not only Culpeper but also Frederick and Augusta counties. He traveled far into the western wilderness, beyond the Tidewater region. The experience taught him resourcefulness and endurance and strengthened him in both body and mind. Combined with Lawrence's land projects, it also gave him an interest in Western development that continued throughout his life. He was always ready to speculate in Western holdings and see favorable plans for colonizing the West, and he greatly resented the limitations that the Crown had over time placed on westward movement. In 1752, Lord Fairfax determined to take up his final residence in the Shenandoah Valley and settled there in a log hunting lodge, which he named Greenway Court, after his family's Kentish manor. Washington was sometimes entertained there and had access to a small library that Fairfax had begun to assemble at Oxford. The years 1751 to 52 marked a turning point in Washington's life, for they placed him in control of Mount Vernon. Lawrence, suffering from tuberculosis, went to Barbados in 1751 for his health, taking George with him. From this only trip outside the present borders of the United States, Washington returned with mild symptoms of an attack of smallpox. In July of the following year, Lawrence died, leaving George as the sole heir to his estate, should his daughter Sarah die without issue. As soon as she died within 2 months, Washington, at the age of 20, became the head of one of the finest estates in Virginia. He always considered farming to be a most delicious pursuit. "It is honorable," he wrote, "it is entertaining, and with high judgment it is profitable." And of all the places to farm, he considered Mount Vernon the best. "No estate in the United States is more pleasantly situated," he assured an English correspondent. In later days, his greatest pride was being known as the first farmer of the land. He gradually increased the property until it exceeded 8,000 acres, 3,000 hectares. He enlarged the house in 1760 and further expanded and improved the house and its landscaping in 1784 to 86. He also tried to keep abreast of the latest scientific developments. For the next 20 years, the work and society of Mount Vernon were the main backdrop to Washington's life. He devoted much attention to crop rotation, soil fertilization, and livestock management. He had to manage the 18 slaves who came with the estate and others he purchased later. By 1760, he had paid taxes on 49 slaves, though he strongly disapproved of the institution and hoped for some way to abolish it. At the time of his death, more than 300 slaves were held in quarters on his estate. He was unwilling to sell the slaves lest families be broken up, although their increase in number burdened him with their care and provided him with a surplus of workers, especially when he abandoned tobacco farming. In his will, he bequeathed the slaves he owned to his wife and ordered that they be freed upon his death, declaring that all of them, young, old, and infirm, shall be comfortably clothed and fed by my heirs. Still, only half of his estate accounted for the slaves. The other half, owned by his wife, was included in the Custos estate so that they were intended to go to her heirs upon his death. However, he freed all slaves after her death in 1800. For diversion, Washington enjoyed riding, fox hunting, and dancing, such theatrical performances as he could attend, and duck hunting and sturgeon fishing. He loved billiards and cards, and not only joined racing associations, but also raced his own horses. He excelled in all outdoor pursuits, from wrestling to colt breaking. A friend from the 1750s described him as straight as an Indian, measuring 6 feet 2 inches in his socks, very muscular and broad-shouldered but though large-boned, weighing only 175 pounds, and as long arms and legs. His piercing blue-grey eyes were overshadowed by heavy eyebrows. His nose was large and straight, and his mouth was large and tightly closed. His movements are charming, his walk is magnificent, and he is a splendid horseman. He soon became prominent in community affairs, was an active member and later vestryman of the Episcopal Church, and expressed a desire to stand for the Virginia House of Burgesses as early as 1755. Traditions of John Washington's exploits as an Indian fighter and Lawrence Washington's assistance during the days of George Washington's military service. Shortly after Lawrence's death, Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie appointed George to the Southern District of Virginia at £100 per annum, November 1752. In 1753, he became adjutant of the Northern Neck and Eastern Shore. Later that year, Dinwiddie felt it necessary to warn the French to desist from their encroachments on lands in the Ohio Valley claimed by the Crown. After sending a messenger who failed to reach the destination, he resolved to send Washington. The day he received his order, October 31st, 1753, Washington set out for the French posts. His party consisted of a Dutchman who acted as interpreter, the expert scout Christopher Gist as guide, and 4 others, 2 of them experienced traders with Indians. Theoretically, Britain and France were at peace. In reality, war might come, and Dinwiddie's message was an ultimatum. The French must get out or be driven out. The journey proved uneventful, dangerous, and futile. Washington's party left what is now Cumberland, Maryland, in mid-November, and despite the obstacles of the cold weather and wilderness, reached Fort Le Boeuf, located 20 miles south of what is now Waterford, Pennsylvania, Lake Erie. The French commander was polite, but adamant. As Washington reported, his officers told me that it was their whole design to take the Ohio, and by God, they would do it. Eager to carry back this alarming news, Washington pressed on with gusto. He was lucky to return alive. An Indian fired 15 rounds at them, but missed. As they crossed the Allegheny River on a raft, Washington fell into the ice-filled stream, but saved himself by grabbing hold of one of the logs. That night, he nearly froze to death in his wet clothes. He arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia, on January 16, 1754, where he hastily wrote a record of the journey. Dinwiddie, who was working hard to convince the Crown of the seriousness of the French threat, had it printed, and when he sent it to London, it was reprinted in 3 different forms. The enterprising governor immediately planned an expedition to capture the Ohio country. He made Joshua Fry colonel of a provincial regiment, appointing Washington lieutenant colonel, and put him in charge of recruiting troops. 2 agents of the Ohio Company, who had been appointed by Lawrence Washington and others to develop the lands on the upper Potomac and Ohio rivers, had begun building a fort that later became Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Dinwiddie, ready to begin his war, sent Washington with 2 companies to reinforce the post. In April 1754, the lieutenant colonel set out from Alexandria with about 160 men at his rear. He marched towards the Cumberland, only to find that the French had anticipated the British blow. They had captured the Ohio Company fort and renamed it Fort Duquesne. Happily, the Indians of the area offered cooperation. Washington therefore cautiously struggled to advance to within about 40 miles, 60 kilometers, of the French position, and set up his post at Great Meadows, near what is now Confluence, Pennsylvania. From this base, he launched a surprise attack May 28, 1754, on an advance detachment of 30 French, killing the commander, Colin de Jumonville, and 9 others, and taking the rest prisoners. The French and Indian War had begun. Washington was at once promoted to a full colonel and reinforced, leading a large force of Virginia and North Carolina troops with Indian auxiliaries. But his attack soon brought the entire French army to its knees. They drove 350 of his men into Great Meadows Fort, Fort Necessity, on July 3rd, besieged it with 700 men, and forced its surrender after a day's fighting. The construction of the fort was a mistake, for it lay in the bottom of a waterlogged creek, commanded on 3 sides by the wooded heights that approached it, and it was far from Washington's support. The French agreed to allow the unarmed colonists to return to Virginia with the honors of war, but they forced Washington to promise that Virginia would not build another fort on the Ohio for a year and to sign a paper acknowledging responsibility for de Jumonville's l'assassinat, a word Washington later did not properly define. He returned to Virginia, saddened but proud, to thank the House of Burgesses and to learn that his name had been listed in the London Gazette. His remark, in a letter to his brother, "I have heard the whistle of the bullets, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound," was humorously commented on by the writer Horace Walpole and satirically by King George II. The arrival of General Edward Braddock and his army in Virginia in February 1755, as part of a campaign in New York that was to be a prelude to the Triple Entente. Governor William Shirley's capture of Fort Niagara and Sir William Johnson's capture of Crown Point brought new opportunities and responsibilities for Washington. He had resigned his commission in October 1754, resenting the poor treatment and low pay of colonial officers, and especially the unwritten rule of the British War Office that provincial officers of any rank were subordinate to any officer holding a commission from the king. But he was eager to participate in the war. "My inclinations are strongly inclined to arms," he wrote to a friend. When Braddock praised his qualities and invited him to join the expedition as personal aide-de-camp with the courtesy title of colonel, he accepted. His self-reliance, decisiveness, and skill soon became apparent. At table, he frequently quarreled with Braddock, who was aggressive and dishonest to the colonists when contractors failed to deliver their supplies, while Washington warmly defended them. His freedom of speech was a testament to Braddock's respect for him. Braddock accepted Washington's unwise advice to divide his army, leaving half of it to follow the slow wagon and cattle train, and to lead the other half at high speed against Fort Duquesne. Washington was ill with fever during the month of June, but on July 8th joined the advance guard in a covered wagon, requesting to lead the march on Fort Duquesne with his Virginians and Indian allies, and on July 9th, when the army was ambushed and bloodily defeated. This indomitable energy, with all its splendor, was the secret of his many successes. So ill that he had to use a pillow instead of a saddle, and that Braddock ordered his body servant to keep a special watch over him, Washington, nevertheless, was everywhere at once. At first, he followed Braddock as the general gallantly tried to push his men forward or backward, as the wisest course according to the circumstances. Then he went back to bring up the Virginians from behind and led them to the rear. This was largely due to the flight of the force. His display of his person was as careless as Braddock, who was mortally wounded on his 5th horse. Washington had 2 horses shot from under him, and his clothes cut by 4 bullets without injury. He was present at Braddock's deathbed, assisted in bringing the troops back, and in August 1755, while still only 23 years old, was paid for by being appointed commander of all the Virginia troops. But no part of his later service was remarkable. Knowing that a Maryland captain who held a royal commission would not listen to him, he went north to Boston in February 1756 to settle the question with Governor Shirley, the commander-in-chief in America, and carrying a letter from Dunwoody, had no difficulty in carrying his point. On his return, he was mired in many troubles. He had to guard a weak, thinly settled frontier of about 400 miles, 650 kilometers, with only 700 undisciplined colonial troops to deal with a legislature unwilling to support him, to withstand attacks by drunken and incompetent soldiers, and to endure hardship. It is not surprising that in 1757 his health broke down, and in the last weeks of that year he became so ill with bloody discharge, dysentery, that his physician sent him home to Mount Vernon. By the spring of 1758, he had recovered and returned to duty as colonel of all the Virginians. As part of a grand sweep of several armies organized by British statesman William Pitt the Elder, General John Forbes led a new advance on Fort Duquesne. Forbes decided not to use Braddock's Road, but to cut a new road, west from Raystown, Pennsylvania. Washington refused this route, but played a key role in the movement. In the late fall, the French sacked and burned Fort Duquesne, and Forbes razed Fort Pitt on its site. Washington, who had recently been elected to the House of Burgesses, was able to resign the honorary rank of Brigadier General. Although his officers lamented the loss of so excellent a commander, so sincere a friend, and so amiable a comrade, he left the service with a sense of disappointment. He had thought the war was too slow. The Virginia legislature had been stingy with its vote money. Virginia recruits had come forward reluctantly and had proved of poor quality. Washington had executed a few deserters and severely flogged others. Virginia paid him less than what other colonies offered their troops. Desiring a regular commission, like his half-brother Lawrence, he vainly petitioned Lord Loudoun, the British commander in North America, to grant Braddock the promise he had made. Ambitious for both rank and honor, he was somewhat harsh in asserting his desires and complaining when denied. He returned to Mount Vernon in some despair. Shortly after resigning his commission, Washington married Martha Dandridge, the widow of Daniel Parke Custis, January 6, 1759. She was a few months older than him, the mother of 2 living and 2 stillborn children, and one of Virginia's more fortunate women. Washington had met her the previous March and had asked for her hand in marriage before his campaign with Forbes. Although it does not seem to have been a romantic love match, the marriage brought together 2 compatible temperaments and proved happy. Martha was a good housewife, an amiable companion, and a gracious hostess. Like many well-born women of the time, she had little education, and Washington often assisted her in writing important letters. Some estimates of the property she brought him from this marriage have been exaggerated, but it included many slaves and about 15,000 acres, 6,000 hectares, much of it valuable for Williamsburg. More important to Washington were his 2 stepchildren, John Parke, Jackie, and Martha Parke, Patsy Custis, who were 6 and 4, respectively, at the time of their marriage. He loved and cared for them, was deeply concerned about Jackie's indiscretions, and was devastated when Patsy died just before the Revolution. Jackie died during the war, leaving 4 children. Washington adopted 2 of them, a boy and a girl, and even signed the boy, "Your Papa," in his letters. Childless himself, he had a real family. From the time of his marriage, Washington combined the care of the Custis estate at White House on the York River with the care of Mount Vernon. As his holdings grew, they were divided into farms, each under its own caretaker. But he closely inspected the operation every day and, according to a visitor, often took off his coat and did general labor. As he once wrote, "The middle ground under a man's own eyes is more profitable than the rich land at a distance." By the eve of the Revolution, he had devoted himself to the duties and pleasures of a great landowner, varying from several weeks' attendance each year at the House of Burgesses at Williamsburg. From 1760 to 74, he was also Justice of the Peace for Fairfax County, sitting in court at Alexandria. In no light does Washington appear as the richest, the greatest, and the most industrious man in Virginia. He rose early and worked hard 6 days a week. On Sundays, he attended Pohook Church irregularly 16 times in 1760, entertained company, wrote letters, bought and sold, and sometimes went fox hunting. During these years, he took snuff and smoked a pipe. Throughout his life, he enjoyed Madeira wine and punch. Although wheat and tobacco were his staples, he practiced crop rotation on a 3- or 5-year plan. He had a water-powered flour mill, a blacksmith shop, brick and charcoal kilns, carpenters, and masons. His fisheries provided shad, bass, herring, and other catches, which were salted as food for his slaves. Cooper, weaver, and his own shoemaker turned out barrels, cotton, linen, and woolen goods, and brogans for all necessities. In short, his estates, with his orders to overseers to buy nothing that you can make yourself, were largely self-sufficient communities. But he sent large orders to England for farm implements, tools, paints, fine textiles, hardware, and agricultural books, and was therefore well aware of British trade restrictions. Washington was an innovative farmer and a responsible landowner. He experimented with cattle breeding, acquiring at least one buffalo, hoping to prove its usefulness as a meat animal, and kept the stallion in the herd. He also took pride in his peach and apple orchards. His care of slaves was exemplary. He dressed and fed them carefully, hired a doctor for them for years, generally refused to sell them. "I am against such traffic in the human race on principle," and reformed them gently. They showed such affection that few ran away. During this time, he played a prominent role in the social life of the Tidewater area. The members of the Council and the House of Burgesses, a list of influential Virginians, were all friends. He visited the Byrds of Westover, the Lees of Stratford, the Carters of Shirley and Sabine Hall, and the Levis of Warner Hall. Mount Vernon was often busy with guests on his return. He loved house parties and afternoon teas on the Mount Vernon porch overlooking the majestic Potomac. He was fond of picnics, barbecues, and climbs. And throughout his life, he enjoyed dancing, often traveling to Alexandria for balls. Cards were a constant diversion, and the sums recorded in his accounts were lost in them, the largest amount reaching nearly £10. His diary sometimes states that in bad weather he was at home all day, more at cards. Billiards were a rival pastime. Not only the theatre, when available, but also concerts, cockfights, circuses, puppet shows, and animal exhibitions were patronized by him. He insisted on the best clothes bought in London: coats, lace waistcoats, hats, colored silk hose. The Randolphs, Corbins, Harrisons, Tylers, Nichols, and other prominent families had the aristocracy in Virginia, and Washington liked to work on a large scale. It has been calculated that in the 7 years before 1775, 2,000 guests came to Mount Vernon, most of whom stayed for dinner. The British ministry, faced with heavy post-war debts, high domestic taxes, and continued military spending in America, decided to levy taxes on the colonies in 1764. Until then, Washington Although regarded by his colleagues as, in the words of Colonel John L. Patton, a young man of extraordinary and high character, had shown no signs of personal greatness and few signs of interest in state affairs. The proclamation of 1763 had prevented settlement beyond the Alleghenies, as he was interested in the Ohio Company, the Mississippi Company, and other speculative Western ventures. Nevertheless, he played a quiet role in the House of Burgesses and was a thoroughly loyal subject, but he was present when Patrick Henry introduced his resolutions against the Stamp Act in May 1765, and soon afterwards gave his stamp of approval to the colonial Whigs against the Tory ministries of England. In 1768, he told George Mason at Mount Vernon that he would carry his musket on his shoulder whenever his country called for it. The following spring, on April 4, 1769, he sent Mason the Philadelphia Non-Importation Resolutions, with a letter declaring that it was necessary to resist the attacks of our masters in England. That after polite protests to Parliament had failed, he fully supported the resort to commercial warfare, and that as a last resort, no man should hesitate to use arms in defense of liberty. When, the following month, the royal governor of Virginia dissolved the House of Burgesses, he participated in the gathering at Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, which drew up non-important resolutions, and he outpaced most of his neighbors in carrying them into effect. At that time, and later, he believed with most Americans that the peace need not be broken. In late 1770, he made a land-hunting visit to Fort Pitt, where George Croghan was finalizing his plans for the proposed 14th colony of Vandalia. Washington directed his agent to locate and survey 10,000 acres of land adjacent to the Vandalia route, and at one time he wanted to participate in some of Croghan's schemes. But the Boston Tea Party of December 1773 and the bursting of the Vandalia bubble at about the same time turned his attention to the perilous state of the East and of Anglo-American relations. He was not a member of the Virginia Committee of Correspondence, formed in 1773 for the purpose of communicating with the other colonies, but when the Virginia legislators, meeting again irregularly at Raleigh Tavern in May 1774, called for a Continental Congress, he was present and signed the resolutions. Moreover, he was a leading member of the First Provincial Convention or Revolutionary Legislature later that summer, and to that body he delivered a speech much praised for its tactful eloquence, declaring that "I will raise 1,000 men, support them at my own expense, and march at their head to the relief of Boston." The Virginia Provincial Convention promptly elected Washington one of the 7 delegates to the First Continental Congress. By this time, he was known as a radical rather than a moderate, and in several letters of the time, he opposed the continuation of petitions to the British Crown, declaring that they would inevitably meet with a humiliating rejection. "Shall we groan after this groan when we have already tried it in vain?" he wrote. When Congress met in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774, he was at his seat in full uniform, and his attendance at its councils marks the beginning of his national career. His letters of this period show that, although he was a total opponent of the idea of liberty, he was determined that he would never submit to the loss of the fundamental rights of the state, and without which life, liberty, and property are utterly insecure. If the ministry pushed matters to the extreme, he wrote, more blood would be shed on this occasion than ever before in American history. Although he did not serve on any committees, he was a useful member. His advice was sought on military matters, and his weight was attached to advocating a non-export and non-import treaty. He also helped secure the passage of the Suffolk Resolves, which looked to armed resistance as a last resort and did much to harden the king's heart against the United States. United States Constitution. The U.S. Capitol is named after Washington, as are many schools, parks, and cities. Today, his face appears on the U.S. dollar bill and quarter. George Washington, born February 22nd, February 11th, Old Style, 1732, Westmoreland County, Virginia, U.S., died December 14th, 1799, Mount Vernon, Virginia, U.S., was an American general and commander-in-chief of the colonial armies and first U.S. president in 1789 of the United States, 1789 to 97.